What happens when a woman's kindness is mistaken for weakness? This isn't fiction, it's what happens when a woman has nothing left to fear. Sarah Mitchell built a $2 billion empire from nothing. She trusted her husband with her heart and her sister with her secrets. That trust almost destroyed her. But when they thought they'd buried her alive in a psychiatric facility, they made one fatal mistake. They gave her time to plan. What you're about to hear is how a mentally unstable billionaire orchestrated the most brutal corporate revenge in history from inside a padded room, how she turned her own imprisonment into their destruction, and how she proved that the most dangerous woman in the world is one who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Because when they locked her away, they didn't realize they weren't protecting themselves from her. They were trapped in there with her. Sarah didn't just win, she made victory look effortless while her enemies begged for mercy. Hit like if you believe in rising stronger. Drop Phoenix in the comments if this gave you chills. Subscribe for more stories of underdogs who became unstoppable. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the cameras, her smile radiant as the Forbes photographer captured what would become an iconic cover. The headline read, "Woman of the Year built $2 billion empire from nothing." At 35, she was everything the American dream promised. From a trailer park in Alabama to the penthouse of Manhattan's most exclusive building, her story had inspired millions. "One more shot. Sarah," the photographer called out. "Can you hold up the award?" She lifted the crystal trophy, thinking about the 8-year-old girl who once ate cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row because that was all they had. That girl could never have imagined this moment. "Perfect," the photographer said. "That's a wrap." As the crew packed up, Sarah's assistant handed her the phone. Marcus called. He and Jessica are reviewing the quarterly reports in the conference room. Sarah smiled. Her husband of 10 years and her younger sister working together to help run Michtech Industries. She had the perfect family supporting her perfect business. What more could a woman want? The elevator ride to the 50th floor gave her time to think about the Forbes interview. They had asked about her secret to success. "Surround yourself with people you trust completely," she had said. "My husband Marcus handles our international investments, and my sister Jessica runs our marketing division. When family has your back, you can conquer the world." The conference room doors were closed when she arrived. Through the glass, she could see Marcus and Jessica hunched over laptops, deep in conversation. She pushed open the door, expecting to see spreadsheets and profit margins. Instead, she saw Jessica's hand resting on Marcus's thigh. She saw the way they looked at each other before quickly separating. She saw guilt flash across both their faces. "Sarah," Jessica said, her voice unusually high, "we were just finishing up the European expansion numbers." "Right," Marcus added, closing his laptop a little too quickly. "Everything looks good for next quarter." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. She was being paranoid. These were the 2 people she trusted most in the world. "Great," she said, forcing her smile to stay in place. "I'm heading home early today. Emma has a school play, and I promised I wouldn't miss it." As she turned to leave, she caught Marcus and Jessica exchanging another look in the reflection of the conference room window. This time, she couldn't ignore what she saw. It wasn't the look of business partners, it was the look of lovers sharing a secret. That evening, as 8-year-old Emma took her bow on the elementary school stage, Sarah tried to focus on her daughter's proud smile, but her mind kept drifting to that moment in the conference room. The way Jessica's hand had moved so naturally to Marcus's leg. The way they had both looked so guilty when she walked in. "Mommy, did you see me?" Emma asked as they walked to the car. "You were perfect, sweetheart," Sarah said, hugging her daughter tight. Absolutely perfect. But as they drove home through the Manhattan traffic, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her own perfect life was built on something much less solid than she had believed. Marcus was already home when they arrived, playing video games with 6-year-old Tyler in the living room. He looked up and smiled that same charming smile that had made her fall in love with him in college. "How was the play?" he asked. "Wonderful," Sarah said, studying his face for any trace of guilt. "Jessica didn't mention wanting to come." "She had a dinner meeting with the West Coast clients," Marcus said, not meeting her eyes as he said it. Sarah nodded, but something about his tone felt rehearsed, like he had practiced that exact response. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat in her home office staring at her laptop screen. The Forbes article draft was due tomorrow, but she couldn't concentrate on the words. Instead, she found herself thinking about all the little things she had noticed over the past few months. Jessica's new designer clothes that seemed expensive even for her marketing salary. The way Marcus always seemed to know where Jessica was during the day. The private conversations that stopped when Sarah entered a room. She shook her head. She was being ridiculous. Jessica was her sister, the girl she had practically raised after their parents died in a car accident when Jessica was 16. Marcus was her husband, her partner, the father of her children. These were the people who celebrated her successes and supported her through the hard times. But as she tried to focus on writing about her perfect life for Forbes, Sarah couldn't escape the growing certainty that the foundation of everything she had built was starting to crack. 3 days later, Sarah's world exploded. It started with something as simple as a forgotten laptop charger. Marcus had left for his morning run, and his laptop was still open on the kitchen counter. Sarah grabbed her own charger from the drawer, but it was the wrong type. Marcus's would work just fine for the presentation she needed to finish before her 9 a.m. meeting. She unplugged his laptop to move it, and the screen came alive. What she saw made her legs give out beneath her. Photos. Dozens of them. Marcus and Jessica in positions that left no doubt about their relationship. But it wasn't just the images that destroyed her. It was the timestamps. These weren't recent photos. The oldest ones were dated 3 years ago. 3 years. Her sister and her husband had been having an affair for 3 years. With shaking hands, she scrolled through Marcus's messages. What she found was so much worse than simple adultery. "The partnership agreement is ready." Jessica had texted 2 weeks ago. "Once Sarah signs it, we'll control 45% of the company between us. With your pre-existing 20% and my new 25%, we can outvote her on any major decision." Marcus's response made Sarah's blood turn to ice. Perfect. And if she becomes mentally unstable from the divorce proceedings, the incapacitation clause kicks in. You'd get full control as her appointed guardian. "You're brilliant, baby." Jessica had written back. "She still thinks I'm her grateful little sister. She has no idea I've been planning this since I was 18. Sarah scrolled back further, her hands trembling so violently she could barely control the mouse. The conversation history went back years. Years of planning. Years of manipulation. Years of her own sister and husband plotting to steal everything she had built. But the message that truly shattered her was from just last month. "Sometimes I feel bad about this." Marcus had written, "She really loves us both." Jessica's response was swift and brutal. "She's trailer trash who got lucky. She doesn't deserve what she has. We do. Stop being weak. You're right. Once we get the kids' custody sorted, this will all be worth it." Sarah's scream brought the housekeeper running. She found Sarah collapsed on the kitchen floor, hyperventilating and sobbing so hard she couldn't speak. It took 20 minutes for Sarah to calm down enough to send the woman away. She spent the rest of the morning in a haze of disbelief and rage, reading through months of messages. The depth of their betrayal was staggering. They had discussed her most private moments, mocked her background, and planned out exactly how they would take her children and her company. The worst part was realizing how perfectly they had manipulated her. Every time she had praised Jessica's marketing ideas, Jessica had been setting up her own power base within the company. Every time Marcus had suggested a new investment strategy, he had been positioning himself to claim credit for the company's success. They had played her like a fool, the trailer park girl who thought she belonged in their world. When Marcus returned from his run, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop closed in front of her. She had practiced what she would say, but when she saw his face, all her planned words disappeared. "I know," she said simply. Marcus froze in the doorway, still in his running clothes, sweat dripping onto the marble floor. "Know what about you and Jessica, about the partnership agreement, about all of it?" For a moment, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression shifted, and Sarah saw something she had never seen before. Cold calculation. "Sarah," he said, his voice taking on a tone she recognized from his business calls. "I think you're having another episode. Remember what Dr. Peterson said about your anxiety affecting your perception?" Sarah stared at him, even now, caught red-handed. He was trying to gaslight her. "I saw the photos, Marcus. I read the messages." "What photos, Sarah? You're scaring me. Maybe we should call Dr. Peterson." The audacity of his denial was breathtaking. But before Sarah could respond, she heard Jessica's key in the front door. Her sister walked into the kitchen wearing the same dress from one of the photos, looking between them with perfectly feigned concern. "What's going on?" Jessica asked. "Sarah, you look upset." "She thinks we're having an affair," Marcus said, shaking his head sadly. "She was going through my laptop." Jessica's eyes widened in what looked like genuine shock. "Sarah, how could you think that I'm your sister?" Watching them perform this charade, Sarah realized that her amateur hour of suspicion was nothing compared to their professional level of manipulation. They had prepared for this moment. They had practiced their responses. "I saw the photos," Sarah repeated, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "What photos?" Jessica asked, moving closer with apparent concern. "Sarah, there are no photos. You're having another breakdown." "Let me see," Marcus said, reaching for his laptop. Sarah opened it and navigated to the folder she had found. It was empty. Every photo, every message, every piece of evidence had been deleted. "There's nothing here, Sarah," Marcus said gently. "I think you need to rest." But Sarah had learned something in her years building a tech company. She quickly opened the recently deleted folder. There they were, hundreds of files, deleted within the last hour while Marcus was on his run. "There," she said, pointing at the screen. "In the deleted files." Marcus and Jessica looked at each other, and in that split second, Sarah saw their masks slip. The loving husband and grateful sister disappeared, replaced by two people who looked at her like she was an obstacle to be removed. "Sarah," Jessica said, her voice losing its warmth, "you're clearly having a mental health crisis. Maybe it's time we talked about getting you some help." "Real help," Marcus added, "the kind that might require some time away from the company and the children." As Sarah looked at their faces, she realized she wasn't just dealing with an affair. She was dealing with two people who had been planning her destruction for years, and they were just getting started. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find her world systematically falling apart. It started with a phone call from her lawyer. "Sarah, I need to see you immediately," David Chen said. his usually calm voice strained with urgency. "Don't discuss this with anyone, especially not Marcus or Jessica." An hour later, Sarah sat in David's downtown office, staring at a stack of legal documents that made her stomach turn. "He filed this yesterday afternoon," David said, sliding the papers across his desk. "Emergency custody petition based on your alleged mental instability." Sarah read the first page with growing horror. Marcus was claiming that she had become increasingly paranoid and erratic. The petition included statements from Dr. Peterson, her therapist, about her anxiety medication. It included testimony from Jessica about Sarah's violent outbursts at the office. It even included statements from their housekeeper about finding Sarah collapsed and screaming in the kitchen. "This is all lies," Sarah whispered. "The problem is, it's very well documented lies," David said grimly. "Marcus has been building this case for months. Every therapy session, every moment of stress, every time you raised your voice in a meeting, he's reframed it all as evidence of mental instability. What about the partnership agreement, the one that gives Jessica control if I'm incapacitated?" David's face darkened. "That's the worst part. You signed it last month." "I never signed anything like that." "You did. It was buried in a stack of routine corporate documents, page 47 of a 50-page update to the company bylaws. Your signature is right there." Sarah stared at her own signature on the document. She remembered signing those bylaws. Marcus had brought them to her during a particularly stressful week, explaining they were just routine updates. She had trusted him and signed without reading every page. "There's more," David continued. "The court has granted a temporary restraining order. You're not allowed within 500 feet of Marcus or the children until the hearing." "What?" Sarah stood up so quickly, her chair fell backward. "They can't keep me from my own children. The judge signed it this morning. Based on Marcus's petition and Jessica's supporting testimony about your increasingly violent behavior." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. "When is the hearing?" 2 weeks. But Sarah, I have to be honest with you. This case is very strong. Marcus has been planning this for a long time." As Sarah left David's office, she realized that her discovery of the affair had been perfectly timed. They had wanted her to find out. They had wanted her to confront them so they could use her reaction as evidence of her mental instability. She drove home through the Manhattan traffic, rehearsing what she would say to Emma and Tyler. How do you explain to an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old that their father is trying to take them away from their mother? But when she arrived at their penthouse, the doorman stopped her in the lobby. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell, but I have instructions not to allow you upstairs." "This is my home," Sarah said, not understanding. "I know, ma'am, but I have a court order. You'll need to speak to your lawyer." Standing in the marble lobby of her own building, surrounded by the luxury she had worked her entire life to achieve, Sarah realized she was homeless. The woman who had built a $2 billion empire couldn't even access her own apartment. Her phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. "Sarah." Jessica's voice was full of fake concern. "I heard about the court order. This is all so unfortunate." "Let me talk to my children," Sarah said. "They're very upset right now. Marcus thinks it's better if they have some space to process everything. They're my children, Jessica, and they love you. But right now, they need stability. The kind of stability that someone in your condition can't provide." Sarah closed her eyes. Even now, Jessica was playing the role of the concerned sister. "What do you want?" "I want you to get help. Real help. Check yourself into a facility, get the treatment you need, and maybe we can work something out. And while I'm gone, you run my company. Someone has to. The board is already concerned about your recent behavior. If you voluntarily step down for medical reasons, we can probably keep this quiet. Avoid a public scandal." Sarah understood the subtext. They had her trapped completely. Fight the custody case and lose her children while destroying her company's reputation in a public battle, or surrender now and lose everything quietly. "I need time to think," Sarah said. "Of course, but don't take too long. The children are asking questions we'd rather not have to answer." That night, Sarah sat in a hotel room overlooking Central Park, staring at her phone. She had tried calling Emma and Tyler a dozen times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Marcus had probably changed their numbers. She thought about calling her friends, but realized with growing horror that most of her social circle was also her business circle. How many of them were already hearing Jessica's version of events? How many had already chosen sides? The knock on her door came at midnight. Sarah opened it to find Rebecca Martinez, her best friend since college, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of fierce determination. "I heard," Rebecca said, pushing past Sarah into the room. "Marcus called me with some bullshit story about you having a breakdown. I told him he could shove his concern where the sun doesn't shine." For the first time all day, Sarah smiled. Rebecca was an investigative journalist for the New York Herald, which meant she had a built-in suspicion of any story that seemed too convenient. "Thank God," Sarah said, hugging her friend. "I was starting to think I was losing my mind." "Oh, honey, you're not losing your mind. You're being played by professionals." Rebecca opened the wine and poured 2 large glasses. "Now tell me everything, and I mean everything. Because if Marcus and Jessica think they can destroy my best friend without a fight, they clearly don't know who they're dealing with." As Sarah told Rebecca the whole story, she felt hope returning for the first time since finding those photos. She wasn't alone. She had an ally. And Rebecca Martinez had never lost an investigation in her life. "Here's what we're going to do," Rebecca said after hearing everything. "We're going to dig up every piece of dirt on both of them. We're going to prove this whole thing is a setup. And then we're going to destroy them so completely that they'll wish they had never heard your name." Sarah raised her wine glass. "To destroying them." "To getting your life back," Rebecca corrected. "The destruction is just a bonus." But as they clinked glasses, neither woman suspected that their conversation was being recorded. The hotel room Jessica had suggested Sarah book was already under surveillance, and the trap that had seemed complete was about to get much, much deeper. Sarah spent the next week working with Rebecca to build their case. They rented a small office space under Rebecca's name and turned it into a war room. The walls were covered with photos, documents, and timeline charts mapping out Marcus and Jessica's deception. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to a financial document. "Marcus has been moving money to offshore accounts for 2 years. Small amounts, but they add up to almost $5 million. Sarah studied the bank records Rebecca had obtained through her journalist contacts. "That's embezzlement. Corporate funds moved to personal accounts." "Exactly. And look at the timing." Rebecca pointed to the dates. "Every transfer happens right after a major company success. He's been systematically stealing from the profits." For the first time since discovering the affair, Sarah felt genuinely hopeful. They had evidence of actual crimes, not just moral failings. This could change everything. "There's more," Rebecca said, opening another file. "Jessica's marketing contracts. She's been setting up deals with shell companies owned by her friends, then collecting kickbacks on the side." Sarah shook her head in amazement. "I gave her complete control over a $50 million marketing budget. And she's been skimming at least 20% of it. We're talking about $10 million over 3 years. This is it. Sarah said, feeling energy return to her voice. This proves everything. They haven't just been planning to steal my company, they've already been stealing from it. That afternoon, Sarah marched into the offices of Peterson, Williams and Associates, the law firm handling Marcus's custody case. She demanded an immediate meeting with the lead attorney. Mrs. Mitchell, Jonathan Williams said, looking uncomfortable as Sarah spread financial documents across his conference table. I'm not sure this is appropriate. I represent your husband in these proceedings. Then you need to see what kind of man you're representing, Sarah said. This is evidence of systematic embezzlement and fraud. Williams barely glanced at the documents. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're upset about the custody situation, but making wild accusations isn't going to help your case. These aren't accusations. These are bank records, proof that Marcus has stolen millions from our company. According to these documents, your husband moved money between various corporate accounts. As CFO, that's within his authority. Sarah stared at him. CFO Marcus isn't the CFO. He's never been the CFO. Williams pulled out a file and showed her a corporate document. According to the paperwork, Marcus had been appointed Chief Financial Officer 6 months ago. Sarah's signature was on the appointment letter. I never signed this, Sarah said, but even as she said it, she recognized her own handwriting. Mrs. Mitchell, I think you should discuss these concerns with your own attorney, and perhaps your doctor. As Sarah left the law office, she realized the trap was even more sophisticated than she had imagined. They hadn't just been planning to steal her company after destroying her marriage. They had been systematically giving Marcus legal authority to control the company's finances while documenting her supposed mental instability. Her phone rang as she reached the street. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. Sarah, we need to meet. Now. Something's wrong. They met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from their usual Manhattan haunts. Rebecca looked shaken, which was unusual for a woman who had interviewed war criminals and corrupt politicians without flinching. I got a call from my editor, Rebecca said without preamble. The Herald is killing my story. What do you mean, killing it? They're not going to publish the investigation into Marcus and Jessica. My editor says it's too close to home, too personal, a conflict of interest because you're my friend. Sarah felt her heart sinking. Can't you take it somewhere else? I tried. I called 5 other publications. None of them want to touch it. Rebecca leaned forward across the small table. Sarah, this doesn't happen by coincidence. Someone with serious influence is making sure this story doesn't get out. Marcus doesn't have that kind of power. No, but his mother does. Sarah had almost forgotten about Victoria Sterling. Marcus's mother. The woman came from old New York money, the kind that opened doors and closed mouths across the city's media landscape. She's been working behind the scenes, Rebecca continued. I did some digging. Victoria sits on the board of directors of 3 major media companies. She has lunch with the publisher of the Herald every month. She's been preparing for this battle longer than we realized. So what do we do? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I think you should consider taking their deal. Check yourself into a treatment facility. Let Jessica run the company temporarily, and hope you can rebuild your relationship with the kids when you get out. Sarah stared at her best friend. You're giving up. I'm being realistic. They have too much power, too much money, and too much influence. This isn't a fair fight. Since when do you back down from a fight? Rebecca wouldn't meet her eyes. Since I realized what we're up against. That night, Sarah sat alone in her hotel room, staring at the business card Dr. Peterson had given her months ago. Serenity Springs Treatment Center, a discreet facility for executives dealing with stress and addiction issues. She could check herself in tomorrow, admit to having a breakdown. Let Marcus and Jessica have the company temporarily. Maybe, if she played along with their narrative, she could salvage some relationship with her children. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. "The kids are asking about you. Emma drew you a picture. Maybe it's time to think about what's best for them." Attached was a photo of Emma's drawing. A stick figure family with mommy separated from daddy, Tyler, Emma, and Aunt Jessica by a large black line. Sarah was still staring at the drawing when her phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Don't take the deal," Rebecca said without greeting. "What changed your mind?" "I got another call from my editor. He offered me a promotion and a raise to drop the story, effective immediately." Sarah sat up straighter. "That's good news, isn't it?" "Sarah, I've worked at the Herald for 12 years. I've never gotten a promotion without asking for one, and the timing is too convenient." Rebecca's voice was hard with anger. "They're trying to buy me off, which means they're scared of what we might find. So what do? We go deeper. We find something so big they can't bury it, and we make sure the whole world sees it. Rebecca, if you do this, you could lose your job. Honey, if I don't do this, I'll lose myself. Besides." Rebecca's voice took on the tone Sarah remembered from their college days, when Rebecca had taken on the university administration over their handling of sexual assault cases. "I've always been better at asking forgiveness than permission." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that giving up wasn't just about accepting defeat. It was about accepting the version of herself that Marcus and Jessica wanted her to be. The weak, unstable woman who couldn't handle the pressure of running a major corporation. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't built a $2 billion empire by accepting other people's limitations. She had gotten this far by refusing to stay in the boxes others tried to put her in. Tomorrow, she would fight back, and she would fight dirty. The next morning brought disaster in the form of a phone call from David Chen, her lawyer. "Sarah, you need to get down here immediately. The FBI just raided your office." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What?" "Federal agents executed a search warrant an hour ago. They're seizing all financial records related to the offshore accounts we discussed." Sarah dressed quickly and raced to her company's headquarters. The scene outside the building was chaos. News vans lined the street, reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving, and federal agents carried boxes of documents out the front door. She found David waiting in the lobby, his face grim. "It gets worse," he said. "Jessica called a board meeting this morning. They voted to suspend you pending the outcome of the federal investigation." "They can't do that. I'm the majority shareholder." "Actually, you're not anymore." David handed her a document. "The partnership agreement you signed included a clause transferring your voting rights to Jessica in the event of any federal investigation into the company's finances." Sarah read the document with growing horror. Once again, her own signature condemned her. "David, I swear to you, I never read this clause. I believe you, but the signature is clearly yours, and it's been notarized." "Then someone forged the notarization." "The notary is Margaret Chen, Jessica's college roommate. She's prepared to testify that she watched you sign it willingly." Sarah realized she was looking at a conspiracy that had been years in the making. Every document, every witness, every legal detail had been carefully prepared. "There's something else," David said. "The FBI wants to interview you this afternoon." "About what? Money laundering?" "Specifically, about your knowledge of the offshore accounts Marcus has been using." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. "I didn't know about any offshore accounts until Rebecca found them." "Can you prove that?" Sarah thought about it. Could she prove a negative? Could she prove she hadn't known about something? Especially when the man who had set up those accounts was her husband and business partner, David. They're framing me. I know, but they're doing it very well. That afternoon, Sarah sat in a small, windowless room at the FBI field office, facing two agents who looked like they had already decided she was guilty. Mrs. Mitchell, Agent Rodriguez said, opening a thick file. We're investigating allegations of money laundering and tax evasion related to your company's offshore accounts. I didn't know about any offshore accounts. These accounts were opened using your corporate signature authority, Agent Thompson added. Are you saying you don't remember signing these documents? They showed her a stack of banking forms, all bearing her signature. Sarah stared at them, recognizing her own handwriting, but having no memory of signing any of them. Your husband says you were present for all these signings, Agent Rodriguez continued. He says you specifically requested that these accounts be kept confidential to avoid scrutiny from your board of directors. That's a lie. He's provided us with emails where you discuss the need for financial privacy. Would you like to see them? They showed her printed emails from her own account, discussing offshore investments and tax strategies. The writing style was hers. The concerns seemed legitimate, and the email headers showed they had been sent from her computer. I never sent these emails. Mrs. Mitchell, your computer shows no signs of unauthorized access. Your email account shows no evidence of hacking. These messages were sent during business hours from your office computer using your login credentials. Sarah realized that Marcus, with his access to their home office and knowledge of her passwords, could have sent those emails easily, but proving that would be impossible. We also have testimony from Jessica Sterling, your sister and business partner, Agent Thompson said. She says you became increasingly secretive about the company's finances over the past year. She says you excluded her from meetings with Marcus about international investments. Jessica is lying. She and Marcus are having an affair. They're trying to steal my company. The agents exchanged a look. Agent Rodriguez made a note in his file. Mrs. Mitchell, are you currently taking medication for anxiety or depression? That's not relevant. Your husband has expressed concern about your mental state. He says you've been making paranoid accusations against family members. Sarah realized that every word she said was being used to support their narrative of her mental instability. The more she protested her innocence, the more paranoid she sounded. I want to see my lawyer, she said. Of course. But Mrs. Mitchell, I should let you know that we're prepared to file charges: money laundering, tax evasion, and corporate fraud. You're looking at 20 years in federal prison. Unless, Agent Thompson added, you're willing to cooperate with our investigation. What kind of cooperation? Full disclosure of all offshore accounts and financial arrangements, a guilty plea to reduce charges, and your complete withdrawal from any involvement in the company's operations. Sarah understood. They weren't really after her for money laundering. They were using the threat of prosecution to force her to surrender her company voluntarily. I need time to think. You have 24 hours. After that, we file charges and everything becomes public. As Sarah left the FBI building, she found Rebecca waiting by her car. How bad is it? Rebecca asked. They have me completely boxed in. If I fight the charges, I'll be tied up in federal court for years while Jessica runs my company. If I take their deal, I lose everything but avoid prison. There has to be another option. Like what they've thought of everything. Sarah leaned against her car, suddenly exhausted. Maybe I should just take the deal. At least I'd be free to try to rebuild some relationship with my kids. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a text message. I got this an hour ago, Rebecca said, The message was from an unknown number. Stop investigating or your mother's nursing home will lose its Medicare funding. Sarah stared at the message. They threatened your mother. My mother has Alzheimer's. She's in a memory care facility that costs $8,000 a month. If they pull her Medicare funding, I can't afford to keep her there. Rebecca, I'm so sorry. No, you're missing the point. Rebecca's eyes were bright with anger. They're not just covering up an affair and some embezzlement. They're threatening an 80-year-old woman with dementia. That's not desperation. Sarah, that's something much worse. What do you mean? I mean, we're not dealing with opportunists who saw a chance to steal your company. We're dealing with people who destroy lives for sport. Rebecca put her phone away. And people like that always make mistakes. We just have to be smart enough to catch them. How? By giving them exactly what they think they want, and then watching what they do when they think they've won. That night, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She called Jessica. I'll take the deal, she said. I'll check into Serenity Springs tomorrow and transfer operational control to you. Oh, Sarah! Jessica's voice was full of fake relief. This is the right choice, for everyone. I want to see the children before I go. Of course, I'll arrange something. But as Sarah hung up the phone, she wasn't surrendering. She was setting a trap. Because Rebecca was right about one thing. People who destroyed lives for sport always got careless when they thought they had won. And Sarah Mitchell was about to become very, very dangerous. The meeting with Emma and Tyler took place at Victoria Sterling's mansion on the Upper East Side. The house was everything Sarah's trailer park childhood had taught her to resent old money, inherited privilege, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having to struggle for anything. Victoria herself greeted Sarah at the door. At 65, Marcus's mother was still beautiful in the cold, aristocratic way that money could preserve. Her smile was perfectly polite and completely empty. Sarah, dear, the children are in the sunroom. Emma and Tyler ran to her the moment she entered the room, and for a few precious minutes, Sarah felt like herself again, her daughter's arms around her neck, her son's excited chatter about his new school, the simple joy of being their mother. Mommy, are you sick? Emma asked, her 8-year-old eyes serious with concern. I'm just tired, sweetheart. I need to rest for a while. Daddy says you might not come back, Tyler said, his 6-year-old voice small and worried. Sarah's heart broke a little more. I will always come back to you, no matter what anyone says. I will always be your mommy. Marcus appeared in the doorway, watching the scene with an expression Sarah couldn't read. Kids, why don't you go play in the garden? Mommy and I need to talk. When they were alone, Marcus sat across from her in one of Victoria's antique chairs. For a moment, he looked like the man she had fallen in love with in college. Young, uncertain, almost vulnerable. You know, I didn't want it to happen this way, he said quietly. What way did you want it to happen? I thought maybe you'd just step back voluntarily, retire early, focus on the kids. We could have gotten divorced quietly, shared custody, maintained some kind of family. Sarah stared at him. You thought I'd just hand over the company I built because you asked nicely. It's not just your company, Sarah. I've been part of it for 10 years. You've been the face of it. I've been the brain. Marcus's expression hardened. That's exactly the kind of arrogance that made this necessary. Made what necessary? Stealing from me, lying to me, turning my own sister against me. Jessica was never really your sister. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. What does that mean? Marcus looked almost pitying. She's Victoria's niece, my cousin. We've known each other our whole lives. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. That's impossible. Jessica came to live with us after our parents died. She was 16. Her parents aren't dead. Sarah, they live in Connecticut. Jessica volunteered to be placed in the foster system when she heard about the brilliant scholarship girl from Alabama who was about to get very rich very quickly. You're lying. Check the adoption records. Oh wait, you can't. Because there are no adoption records. Jessica was never legally adopted by your parents. She just lived with you until she turned 18. Sarah thought back to those years. Jessica had always been secretive about her past, claiming the memories of losing their parents were too painful to discuss. Sarah had assumed it was trauma, had protected her younger sister from having to talk about it. Why? Sarah whispered. Because Victoria saw your potential before you did. A brilliant girl from nothing, destined to build something remarkable. All we had to do was position ourselves to be part of it. All of this was planned from the beginning. Not all of it. I really did love you, at first. But love doesn't pay for the lifestyle Victoria raised me to expect. Marcus stood up, straightening his jacket. The affair with Jessica wasn't part of the original plan. That just happened, but it made everything easier. Sarah felt like she was drowning. How long have you known that Jessica wasn't really my sister? I've always known. I met her at Victoria's house when we were kids, long before I met you. Marcus paused at the door. The irony is, if you had just been satisfied with being rich instead of needing to be important, we could have made this work, but you always had to be the smartest person in the room. After Marcus left, Sarah sat alone in Victoria's sunroom, surrounded by the kind of luxury she had spent her life trying to achieve, feeling more lost than she had in the trailer park of her childhood. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Emergency. Meet me at the usual place. Come alone. Sarah found Rebecca pacing frantically in their rented office space. The walls that had been covered with their investigation materials were now bare. They took everything, Rebecca said without preamble. FBI raid this morning. They seized all our files, all our evidence, everything. How did they know about this place? I don't know. But Sarah, there's something else. Rebecca's face was pale. They didn't just take the files. They left something behind. She handed Sarah a single photograph. It showed Sarah entering the office building 3 days earlier, but the timestamp on the photo was from 6 months ago. Someone had doctored the image to make it look like Sarah had been using this space for much longer than she actually had. They're setting us up, Rebecca said, making it look like we've been planning some kind of conspiracy for months. Who's they? Marcus and Jessica don't have this kind of reach. No, but Victoria Sterling does. Rebecca pulled out her laptop. I've been digging into her background. Sarah, she's not just old money. She's smart money. She sits on the boards of 12 major corporations, has connections throughout federal law enforcement, and owns significant stakes in half the media companies in New York. So she's been orchestrating all of this. I think she's been orchestrating you. From the beginning. Rebecca opened a file on her computer. Look at this. Victoria Sterling made a substantial donation to your college scholarship fund the year before you graduated. She was also a major investor in the first venture capital firm that funded your startup. Sarah stared at the financial records. Her entire rise to success suddenly looked different, not the result of her own brilliance and hard work, but the product of careful manipulation by a woman who had been planning to harvest that success for her own family. There's more, Rebecca continued. Every major business deal you've made, every partnership, every expansion into new markets, Victoria or one of her associates has been involved somehow. She's been controlling my company all along. Not controlling, guiding, making sure you succeeded just enough to be worth taking. Sarah's phone rang. Victoria Sterling's name appeared on the screen. "Answer it," Rebecca whispered, but put it on speaker. "Hello, Victoria." "Sarah, dear, I understand you'll be checking into Serenity Springs tomorrow. I think that's very wise." "Do you?" "Of course. You've been under such tremendous stress, building a company from nothing, raising 2 children, managing a failing marriage. It's no wonder you've been having such difficulties." Sarah looked at Rebecca, who was frantically taking notes. "What difficulties?" "Well, the paranoid accusations against your family, for one thing. The financial irregularities you've been trying to cover up. The drinking. I don't drink. Not yet. Perhaps. But the prescription medications you've been mixing with alcohol could easily lead to substance dependency. Dr. Peterson is very concerned about your Xanax usage." Sarah realized that Victoria was creating a new narrative in real time. Every word of this conversation was probably being recorded, would probably be used as evidence of Sarah's deteriorating mental state. "I think I understand now," Sarah said carefully. "This was never about Marcus and Jessica having an affair." "Oh, my dear, the affair is quite real, and quite passionate, I'm told, but you're right that it's not the point." Victoria's voice took on a colder tone. "The point is that you've served your purpose. You've built something remarkable. Now it's time for people who understand how to manage wealth to take over. People like you. People like my family. Marcus will make an excellent CEO once he's no longer distracted by marriage to someone so far beneath his station. And Jessica has proven quite capable of managing the day-to-day operations. What about my children? Emma and Tyler will be raised as Sterlings. They'll have every advantage money can provide: private schools, Ivy League educations, introduction to the right social circles, everything you could never give them." Sarah felt rage building in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "And me. You'll be comfortable at Serenity Springs. It really is a lovely facility, very discreet. And if you stay there voluntarily, there's no reason for any of this to become public. Your children can remember you as a successful businesswoman who suffered from mental illness, rather than as a criminal who embezzled from her own company." "How generous." "I think so. The alternative is 20 years in federal prison and your children learning that their mother was a fraud who stole millions of dollars." After Victoria hung up, Sarah and Rebecca sat in silence for a long moment. "We can't fight this," Rebecca finally said. "She has too much power, too many connections, too much money." "No," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "We can't fight this the way we've been fighting it." "What do you mean?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a real smile. "Victoria Sterling has spent years manipulating me by making me think I was in control, making me think I was building my own empire when I was really just building hers." "Right. So now I'm going to manipulate her. I'm going to make her think she's won, while I build something she can't see coming." "Sarah, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about playing a game Victoria Sterling doesn't even know exists. She thinks she's conquered the trailer park girl who got lucky, but she's never dealt with the trailer park girl who has nothing left to lose." Rebecca looked at her with growing excitement. "What's the plan?" "The plan is to give Victoria exactly what she wants, and then take everything that matters to her." "How?" Sarah's smile turned cold. "By remembering something Victoria has forgotten. I didn't build a $2 billion empire by playing by other people's rules, and I'm not going to lose it that way either." Sarah checked into Serenity Springs Treatment Center on a gray October morning, carrying a single suitcase and wearing the defeated expression everyone expected to see. The facility was everything Victoria had promised: discreet, expensive, and perfectly designed to keep wealthy people's problems hidden from the world. Her roommate was Claire Morrison, a pharmaceutical heiress who had been caught embezzling from her family's foundation. Claire was 3 months into a court-mandated stay, which had given her plenty of time to study their fellow patients. The trick is to seem like you're making progress without actually changing anything, Claire explained during their first conversation. Participate in group therapy, follow the rules, and act grateful for the opportunity to heal. Most people are out in 6 months. 6 months. Sarah had been hoping for less time. Unless you're in the special program, Claire lowered her voice. There are about a dozen patients who never seem to get better. They've been here for years. The staff calls them long-term residents, but we call them the forgotten ones. What makes someone a long-term resident? Having enemies with very deep pockets, Claire said darkly. People who find it convenient to have certain individuals declared permanently incapable of managing their own affairs. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed thinking about the forgotten ones. Was that Victoria's real plan? Not just to steal her company, but to trap her in this place indefinitely. The next morning brought her first group therapy session, led by Dr. Angela Foster, a woman whose kind smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah, would you like to tell us what brought you here? I've been having trouble managing stress, Sarah said, using the language she knew they wanted to hear. My marriage was falling apart, and I started making poor decisions at work. What kind of poor decisions? Sarah had rehearsed this answer. I became paranoid about my husband and sister. I accused them of things that weren't true. I started seeing conspiracies everywhere. The other patients nodded sympathetically. They had all been where Sarah was pretending to be. After the session, Dr. Foster asked Sarah to stay behind. I've reviewed your case file, Dr. Foster said. You've been through a tremendous trauma. Discovery of infidelity, financial difficulties, the stress of running a major corporation. It's no wonder you experienced a psychological break. That's what my family keeps telling me. Your sister Jessica has been very concerned about you. She calls twice a week to check on your progress. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger, but kept it off her face. That's thoughtful of her. She's also been asking about your treatment timeline. She seems very eager for you to recover fully before returning to any business responsibilities. I'm sure she is. Dr. Foster made a note in Sarah's file. I think we should focus on helping you accept what happened to your marriage and your company. Acceptance is the first step toward healing. That afternoon, Sarah called Rebecca from the facility's payphone. How are you holding up? Rebecca asked. Better than expected. But Rebecca, I need you to do something for me. It's going to sound crazy. Crazier than anything else we've been through. I need you to disappear. There was silence on the other end of the line. What do you mean, disappear? I mean, quit your job, leave New York, and go somewhere they can't find you. Sarah, I'm not abandoning you. You're not abandoning me. You're becoming my secret weapon. Sarah lowered her voice. Victoria thinks she's neutralized both of us. You by threatening your mother, me by locking me up here. But if you disappear, she'll assume you gave up. She won't be watching you anymore. What do you want me to do? Remember when we were in college and you did that expose on the university's financial aid fraud? You didn't just gather evidence. You created a network of sources inside the system. Right. It took me 2 years to build those relationships. I need you to do the same thing now. but not with universities. With the federal agencies investigating me, Rebecca was quiet for a moment. You want me to find allies inside the FBI. I want you to find out who's really running this investigation, because I guarantee you it's not the agents who interviewed me. That's incredibly dangerous, Sarah. So is leaving me here to become one of the forgotten ones. That evening, Sarah attended her first dinner in the facility's main dining room. The other patients were a mix of wealthy individuals dealing with various scandals, insider trading, tax evasion, domestic violence, substance abuse. All of them had the same hollow look of people who had lost everything they thought mattered, except for one man sitting alone in the corner. Thomas Chen, according to his name tag, was about 60 years old with the kind of sharp eyes that suggested his mind was still completely functional despite whatever had landed him here. Sarah approached his table. "Mind if I sit, please?" His voice was cultured, educated. "You're the tech billionaire, Sarah Mitchell. Former tech billionaire. Are you former? Sarah studied his face. "What do you mean?" "I've been here for 14 months, Thomas said quietly. "Long enough to watch several people check in with similar stories. Powerful spouse, family betrayal, mysterious financial irregularities, and questions about mental competency. You think it's a pattern? I think there are people who have turned wealthy individuals' mental health into a very profitable business." Thomas leaned forward. "Tell me, did your husband's family suggest this particular facility?" "His mother did. And I bet she's on the board of directors." Sarah felt her heart racing. "How did you know that?" "Because Victoria Sterling was on the board when I was committed here, just like she was when Patricia Holbrook was committed, and David Kim and Margaret Torres." "Who are they?" "Three of the forgotten ones. All wealthy individuals who had the misfortune of trusting the wrong family member." Thomas's smile was grim. "Welcome to Victoria Sterling's private prison, Ms. Mitchell. I hope you have a better escape plan than the rest of us." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about Thomas's words. She wasn't just fighting for her company and her children. She was fighting to avoid becoming another one of Victoria's forgotten victims. But unlike Patricia Holbrook, David Kim, and Margaret Torres, Sarah had advantages they hadn't possessed. She had Rebecca on the outside, working to build a network of allies. She had Claire Morrison, who understood how the facility operated. She had Thomas Chen, who had been studying Victoria's methods for over a year. Most importantly, she had something Victoria had never bothered to understand about her. Sarah Mitchell hadn't survived her childhood in a trailer park by accepting defeat. She had survived by learning to fight dirty when fighting clean wasn't enough. And Victoria Sterling was about to discover that the trailer park girl she had underestimated was much more dangerous than the billionaire she had tried to destroy. The phoenix was preparing to rise, and when it did, Victoria's carefully constructed world was going to burn. 3 weeks into her stay at Serenity Springs, Sarah had established herself as a model patient. She attended every therapy session, participated in group discussions, and showed steady improvement in accepting her delusions about her family's betrayal. Dr. Foster was pleased with her progress. What Dr. Foster didn't know was that Sarah was using the facility's patient privilege system to build an intelligence network that would have impressed the CIA. It started with Claire Morrison, whose pharmaceutical family connections gave her access to medical records and insider information about the facility's operations. Then came Thomas Chen, whose 14 months of careful observation had mapped out every staff member's schedule, every security protocol, and every patient's real story. The breakthrough came when Sarah met Elena Vasquez during craft therapy. Elena was officially there for stress-related anxiety following a difficult divorce, but the truth was much more interesting. My ex-husband is a federal prosecutor, Elena whispered while they worked on a pottery project. He had me committed here after I discovered he was taking bribes from defense attorneys. Did you report him? Sarah asked quietly. I tried, but who believes the mentally unstable ex-wife of a respected federal prosecutor? Elena's hands shook as she shaped her clay. He's been here 6 times to visit me. Each time, he brings Dr. Foster a very generous donation for the facility's research fund. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. Elena, your ex-husband's name wouldn't happen to be Andrew Vasquez, would it? Elena looked up in surprise. How did you know that Sarah remembered the name from her FBI interview? Andrew Vasquez was the prosecutor assigned to her money laundering case. The man who had given her 24 hours to accept a plea deal was Elena's corrupt ex-husband. Because he's the one trying to send me to federal prison, Sarah said. That evening, Sarah used the facility's payphone to call Rebecca. They had developed a code for their conversations, speaking in terms of therapy techniques and recovery progress, in case anyone was listening. My acceptance therapy is going well, Sarah said, which meant she had new information. That's wonderful. Are you finding the group sessions helpful? Rebecca's response told Sarah she was alone and could speak freely. Very helpful. I've met some interesting people, including someone whose ex-husband works at our old therapy location. The old therapy location was their code for the FBI. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, processing the coded message. That's a remarkable coincidence. What kind of work does he do there? The same kind of work he tried to help me with, but it turns out he wasn't entirely honest about his methods. I see. That's very interesting information for your recovery process. Rebecca, how is your independent study program going? This was Sarah's way of asking about Rebecca's investigation. It's been challenging, but I've made some important connections. I've found 3 other students who were working on similar projects that were suddenly discontinued for mysterious reasons. Sarah understood. Rebecca had found 3 other journalists who had been investigating similar cases of wealthy individuals being systematically destroyed by their own families. That's excellent progress. Do you think you'll be able to complete your research project? I think so, but I'll need more time than we originally planned. This kind of work requires very careful documentation. Take all the time you need. I'm learning patience here. After hanging up, Sarah returned to her room to find Claire waiting with an expression of barely contained excitement. I got it, Claire whispered, holding up a manila folder. Dr. Foster's complete files on the forgotten ones. Sarah opened the folder and felt her blood run cold. There weren't just 4 forgotten ones. There were 12. 12 wealthy individuals who had been committed to Serenity Springs over the past 5 years and never released. The pattern was identical in every case: a family member with connections to Victoria Sterling, accusations of mental instability following the discovery of financial irregularities, and a diagnosis of persistent delusional disorder with paranoid features that made them legally incompetent to manage their own affairs. Look at the financial section, Claire said, pointing to a chart in each file. Every one of the forgotten ones had been worth at least $50 million. Their combined wealth was over $800 million. And in every case, their assets were now being managed by trustees with direct connections to Victoria Sterling's network. It's not just theft, Sarah realized. It's systematic wealth harvesting. There's more, Claire said. I also got Dr. Foster's correspondence files. The emails between Dr. Foster and Victoria Sterling painted a clear picture of their arrangement. Victoria provided donations to the facility's research fund, and Dr. Foster provided long-term care for individuals whose families found their continued freedom inconvenient. One email from 6 months ago made Sarah's hands shake. Mrs. Sterling, Regarding the Mitchell case, I've reviewed the preliminary psychiatric evaluation you provided. The subject shows clear signs of paranoid ideation and difficulty accepting reality. I believe she would benefit greatly from our extended care program. With proper treatment, we can help her reach a state of acceptance that would be beneficial for everyone involved. Victoria's response was chilling in its casualness. Excellent, Dr. Foster. As always, your facility provides exactly the kind of specialized care these troubled individuals require. I'll arrange the usual endowment increase to support your important work. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy, but she was also looking at proof that 12 other people were trapped in the same web that had caught her. Claire, how many of the forgotten ones are still here? All of them. Once you're classified as a long-term resident, you never leave. What if we could prove they're not actually mentally ill? It wouldn't matter. Their families have legal guardianship. The courts trust Dr. Foster's evaluations completely. Sarah stared at the files, thinking about 12 people who had been buried alive in plain sight. Wealthy, successful individuals who had been reduced to forgotten patients in matching pajamas, their lives stolen as systematically as their money. We need to document everything, Sarah said finally. Every file, every email, every piece of evidence of what's happening here. Sarah, even if we expose this, how do we get out? The doors are locked, the phones are monitored, and everyone thinks we're crazy. Sarah smiled, and Claire was surprised by how cold it looked. We don't break out. Claire, we burn it down. What do you mean? I mean, we give Victoria Sterling exactly what she's afraid of. A group of her victims working together, with nothing left to lose and evidence of her crimes. But we're trapped here. No, we're not. We're embedded in the heart of her operation, with access to evidence she doesn't know we have, building a case she can't see coming. Sarah's smile widened. Victoria thinks she's neutralized us by putting us here, but she's actually given us the perfect base of operations. You want to turn the facility into our headquarters. I want to turn it into Victoria Sterling's worst nightmare, a place where her forgotten victims remember how to fight back. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed planning the most audacious corporate takeover in history. She was going to steal back her company, expose a massive criminal conspiracy, and destroy Victoria Sterling's empire. And she was going to do it all from inside a mental health facility while pretending to be grateful for her treatment. The phoenix wasn't just preparing to rise. It was preparing to incinerate everything that had tried to keep it caged. 2 months after checking into Serenity Springs, Sarah had transformed from a broken woman into the commander of a secret army. The forgotten ones weren't forgotten anymore. They were organized, angry, and armed with evidence of the largest wealth theft conspiracy in modern history. Thomas Chen had mapped out every detail of the facility's operations. Claire Morrison had copied every relevant file from Dr. Foster's office. Elena Vasquez had provided inside information about the federal prosecutors involved in fabricating cases against the patients. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Margaret Torres, one of the original forgotten ones, who turned out to be a former federal judge with extensive connections throughout the legal system. I've been watching and waiting for 3 years, Margaret told Sarah during one of their clandestine meetings in the facility's laundry room. Documenting everything, building cases in my head, hoping someone would come along who could actually do something with the information. What kind of information? Margaret handed Sarah a small notebook written in a code she had developed during her years on the bench. Evidence of judicial corruption, prosecutorial misconduct, and systematic abuse of the mental health commitment process. Everything we need to bring down not just Victoria Sterling, but the entire network she's built. How do we get this information to the outside world? We don't We bring the outside world to us. Margaret's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to escape or smuggle evidence out of the facility, they would create a situation that forced outside authorities to investigate Serenity Springs directly. The state conducts surprise inspections of mental health facilities, Margaret explained. But they're always announced in advance through unofficial channels. Dr. Foster always gets 24 hours notice to prepare. So we make sure she doesn't get notice this time. Better than that. We make sure the inspection happens during a crisis that requires immediate federal intervention. The plan they developed was complex, dangerous, and completely insane. It was also their only chance. Rebecca had been building her network of allies for months, and she had finally found the right person, Agent Maria Santos, an FBI investigator who specialized in public corruption cases. Agent Santos had been suspicious of the unusually high conviction rate in federal financial crimes cases prosecuted by Andrew Vasquez. When Rebecca approached her with evidence of systematic judicial corruption, Agent Santos was ready to listen. The problem is access, Agent Santos explained during a covert meeting in Brooklyn. These facilities are private, and we can't get warrants without probable cause that would hold up in court. What if the probable cause came from inside the facility? You mean from patients? Their testimony wouldn't be credible. They're committed mental health patients. What if it came from staff members who were being blackmailed into participating? Agent Santos leaned forward with interest. Do you have evidence of that? Rebecca showed her copies of the emails Claire had photographed. The correspondence between Dr. Foster and Victoria Sterling made it clear that several staff members were uncomfortable with the facility's operations, but were being coerced into compliance. This changes things, Agent Santos said. If we can get one staff member to come forward, we can get warrants for everything. We can do better than that, Rebecca said. We can get you 12 witnesses, all with detailed knowledge of the conspiracy and enough documentary evidence to prosecute everyone involved. The patients, the victims, who happen to include a former federal judge, a pharmaceutical heiress, a tech billionaire, and 9 other people with extensive knowledge of high-level financial crimes. Agent Santos was quiet for a long moment. This would be the biggest public corruption case in decades. That's the idea. The operation they planned required precise timing and absolute secrecy. Sarah and her allies inside Serenity Springs had to create a crisis that would justify immediate federal intervention, while Rebecca and Agent Santos prepared to exploit that crisis to expose the entire conspiracy. The trigger was elegantly simple. Dr. Foster had a weakness. She genuinely believed in her research and was proud of her facility's reputation. When Thomas Chen suggested that she invite a group of federal mental health inspectors for a voluntary excellence review to showcase her innovative treatment methods, she was flattered and eager to agree. What Dr. Foster didn't know was that Thomas had made the suggestion after receiving a coded message from Sarah, who had received it from Rebecca, who had coordinated the timing with Agent Santos. The federal mental health inspectors would actually be FBI agents with warrants to investigate financial crimes connected to the facility. On the morning of the operation, Sarah woke up feeling calm for the first time in months. Today, she would either reclaim her life or lose it completely. But either way, the passive waiting would be over. The FBI team arrived at exactly 10 a.m., just as Dr. Foster was beginning her presentation about the facility's success in treating wealthy individuals with stress-related disorders. Agent Santos identified herself and her team, producing warrants for the seizure of all financial records, patient files, and correspondence related to the facility's operations. There must be some mistake, Dr. Foster said, her face going pale. This is a mental health facility. We treat patients with serious psychological disorders. We're investigating allegations of conspiracy, money laundering, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Agent Santos replied, "We have reason to believe this facility has been used to illegally commit and detain individuals for financial gain." As FBI agents spread throughout the building, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed system was about to collapse, but the best moment came when Agent Santos knocked on the door of Sarah's room. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Agent Maria Santos, FBI. I understand you have some information that might be relevant to our investigation." Sarah stood up slowly, meeting the agent's eyes with a clear, steady gaze. "Agent Santos, I've been waiting for you. We have a lot to discuss." For the first time in months, Sarah Mitchell spoke in her own voice, with her own authority, as herself. Not as a broken woman seeking treatment, not as a mentally ill patient accepting her limitations, but as the brilliant, powerful woman who had built an empire and was about to reclaim it. "I believe you're investigating a conspiracy to defraud wealthy individuals through abuse of the mental health commitment process," Sarah said. "I can provide you with evidence of at least 12 cases, involving over $800 million in stolen assets, and a network of corrupt officials that reaches into federal law enforcement." Agent Santos smiled. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think you're going to be a very valuable witness." As Sarah walked out of Serenity Springs 6 hours later, no longer a patient but a federal witness under FBI protection, she realized that Victoria Sterling had made a crucial mistake. She had assumed that destroying Sarah's company and family would destroy Sarah herself, but Sarah Mitchell hadn't built her empire by accepting other people's definitions of what was possible, and she wasn't going to lose it by accepting their definitions of defeat. The phoenix had risen, and it was time to burn down everything that had tried to keep it caged. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the boardroom of Mistress Industries, looking out at the city skyline through windows that now bore her name again. The FBI investigation had unraveled Victoria Sterling's network completely, exposing a conspiracy that reached into federal courts, prosecutors' offices, and medical facilities across 3 states. Victoria herself sat in federal prison awaiting trial on charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and deprivation of civil rights. The bail hearing had been particularly satisfying for Sarah to attend. Marcus had been arrested at his mother's mansion, where he had been living since Sarah's commitment to Serenity Springs. The charges against him included embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. His arrest had been filmed by news crews and broadcast nationally. Jessica had been found working at a fast food restaurant in Newark, using a fake name and trying to avoid detection. The sight of her former protégé in a uniform and paper hat, being arrested by federal agents, had provided Sarah with a sense of poetic justice she hadn't expected to feel. But the most satisfying moment had come during the congressional hearings into the systematic abuse of mental health commitment laws. Sarah had testified for 3 hours, detailing how wealthy individuals were being systematically stripped of their assets and civil rights by families working with corrupt medical professionals. Her testimony had led to federal legislation strengthening protections for individuals facing involuntary commitment, and the creation of a special prosecutor's office to investigate similar cases nationwide. Today, however, was about something more personal. Today was the day Sarah officially reclaimed control of her company and her life. The boardroom was packed with reporters, investors, and employees who had watched their CEO disappear into a mental health facility and return as the whistleblower who had exposed one of the largest financial conspiracies in American history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "6 months ago, I stood in this room and was told I was mentally unfit to run the company I had built. Today, I stand here as the majority shareholder, CEO, and founder of Mistress Industries. having been vindicated by a federal investigation that exposed the lies told about me and the crimes committed against me. The applause was thunderous. But I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to talk about the future. The future of this company, the future of the 12 individuals who were illegally imprisoned with me, and the future of anyone who thinks they can steal from someone just because they assume that person won't fight back. Sarah clicked a remote, and the screen behind her lit up with financial projections. Mistress Industries has not just survived the attacks against it, we have thrived. During the months I was fighting for my freedom, our team continued to innovate, continued to grow, and continued to prove that this company's strength comes not from any individual, but from our collective commitment to excellence. The numbers on the screen showed record profits, new product launches, and expansion into international markets. Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Legal Defense, endowed with $50 million to provide legal representation for individuals facing fraudulent mental health commitments. Because what happened to me and the 11 other victims we freed from Serenity Springs cannot be allowed to happen to anyone else. The applause was even louder this time. I'm also announcing that Mistress Industries will be expanding our operations to include a new division focused on developing technology to protect individual privacy and financial security. Because the tools that were used against us can be used against anyone, and we have a responsibility to develop better defenses. Sarah paused, looking out at the crowd of faces that had once looked at her with pity and now looked at her with something approaching awe. Finally, I want to say something to anyone who thinks they can destroy someone's life because they believe that person won't be able to fight back. You're wrong. You're wrong about what people are capable of when they have nothing left to lose. You're wrong about what justice looks like when it finally arrives. And you're wrong about what happens when someone who has built something from nothing decides to build it again. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. After the press conference, Sarah stood alone in her office, looking at a framed photograph of Emma and Tyler that had been returned to her along with the rest of her personal belongings. The custody case had been dismissed when Marcus was arrested, and her children were back home where they belonged. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, who had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation into the Serenity Springs conspiracy. Dinner tonight to celebrate. I promise not to order wine if you promise not to order revenge for dessert. Sarah smiled, typing back, deal, but I'm keeping the revenge as backup, just in case. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. David Park, who had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer after Marcus's arrest, entered with a stack of documents. The Peterson case files, he said, setting them on her desk. Everything we need to help the other facility's victims. Sarah looked at the files, thinking about the dozens of other people who were still trapped in facilities like Serenity Springs, still waiting for someone to remember they existed. How many more do you think there are? She asked, based on the pattern we've identified. Probably hundreds across the country. Sarah nodded. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation would have plenty of work to do. That evening, as she tucked Emma and Tyler into bed in their penthouse apartment, Emma asked the question Sarah had been dreading. Mommy, why did Daddy and Aunt Jessica try to hurt you? Sarah sat on the edge of her daughter's bed, thinking about how to explain adult cruelty to an 8-year-old mind. Sometimes, sweetheart, people make very bad choices because they want things that don't belong to them. But the important thing to remember is that when bad things happen, we don't give up. We fight back, and we make sure it doesn't happen to other people. Like you did, like I did. Are you a superhero now? Sarah laughed, remembering a time when that question would have seemed ridiculous. I'm just a mom who learned that sometimes you have to be very brave to protect the people you love. I want to be brave like you when I grow up. You already are, baby. You already are." Later that night, Sarah stood on her balcony overlooking the city, thinking about the journey that had brought her back to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a broken woman sleeping in her car, betrayed by everyone she trusted. Tonight, she was exactly who she had always been, a fighter who refused to stay down. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something told her to answer. "Sarah Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell. My name is Catherine Walsh. I'm calling from Seattle. I read about your case in the news, and I think my family is trying to do the same thing to me." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. It was starting already. The calls from other victims, other families being torn apart by the same systematic cruelty she had survived. "Tell me what's happening." "Catherine, my husband filed for divorce last month. He's claiming I'm mentally unstable because I discovered he's been embezzling from my trust fund. My own brother is supporting him, saying I need professional help. They want me to check into a facility called Peaceful Meadows in Oregon." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Peaceful Meadows had appeared in several of the documents seized from Serenity Springs, another facility in Victoria Sterling's network. "Catherine, whatever you do, don't check into that facility. And don't trust anyone who's telling you that you need help. You need a lawyer. You need to document everything. And you need to call the FBI." "The FBI. But my husband says if I make wild accusations, it'll just prove I'm paranoid." "Your husband is lying to you, just like mine lied to me. Catherine, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not crazy. You are not paranoid. You are being targeted by people who steal lives for profit, but you don't have to face this alone." Sarah gave Catherine the contact information for Agent Santos and for the legal team at the Sarah Mitchell Foundation. As she hung up the phone, she realized that her victory over Victoria Sterling had been just the beginning. There were more Victorias out there, more facilities like Serenity Springs, more families being destroyed by systematic greed disguised as medical intervention. But there were also more fighters like her. More people who would refuse to be forgotten, refuse to be silenced, refuse to accept defeat. Sarah looked out at the glittering lights of Manhattan, thinking about the trailer park girl who had once dreamed of building something that mattered. She had built a company worth billions. But more importantly, she had built something that couldn't be stolen or destroyed, the knowledge that no matter how powerful your enemies, no matter how hopeless your situation, you always have a choice. You can accept their definition of who you are, or you can define yourself. You can play by their rules, or you can change the game entirely. You can let them bury you, or you can rise from the ashes stronger than they ever imagined possible. Sarah Mitchell had learned that the hard way, and now she was going to spend the rest of her life making sure other people didn't have to learn it alone. The phoenix had risen, and it was going to make sure that everyone who had been buried could find their way back to the light. As Sarah finally headed inside to get some sleep, she paused at her desk to look at one more document. It was a letter from Margaret Torres, the former federal judge who had been one of the forgotten ones at Serenity Springs. Margaret had been reinstated to the bench after the investigation cleared her name, and she had written to thank Sarah for refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier. But it was the last line of the letter that made Sarah smile. "You didn't just save us, Sarah. You reminded us who we really are, and that's a gift that can never be taken away." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in the frame next to her children's photo. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new victims to help, new battles to fight. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged home, with her children sleeping safely down the hall, in control of her own life, and ready to help others take control of theirs. The billionaire wife's ultimate revenge hadn't been destroying her enemies. Though that had been satisfying, it had been reclaiming her own power and using it to make sure no one else would have to fight the same battle alone. And that, Sarah thought as she finally turned off the lights, was a legacy worth building an empire for. The phoenix had risen, and it would never be caged again. Sarah Mitchell's story became a landmark case in the fight against systematic financial abuse of vulnerable individuals. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation has since helped free over 200 people from fraudulent mental health commitments and has lobbied successfully for federal legislation protecting individual rights in commitment proceedings. Mitch Tech Industries continues to thrive under Sarah's leadership, and both Emma and Tyler Mitchell have expressed interest in following their mother into technology and legal advocacy. Victoria Sterling was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Marcus Mitchell received 15 years and was stripped of all parental rights. Jessica Sterling received 10 years and was ordered to pay full restitution to Sarah's company. Dr. Angela Foster lost her medical license and received 8 years for her role in the conspiracy. Serenity Springs Treatment Center was permanently closed, and all of its long-term residents were freed and had their assets restored. As for Catherine Walsh in Seattle, she followed Sarah's advice, avoided the trap set for her, and successfully prosecuted her husband for embezzlement. She now volunteers for the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, helping other women recognize the warning signs of systematic financial abuse. The phoenix rises, and sometimes it brings the light that helps other phoenixes find their way home.